Well, next up we have another presentation from one of our great research teams. So please direct your attention to the screens for the introduction.
Amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, the construction industry demonstrated resilience by utilizing innovation to create opportunities. Research Team 400 used 40 expert interviews and 245 survey responses to gain valuable insights and identify which positive changes should be retained by the industry. Industry leaders can adopt and enhance strategies based on the team's guide to drive innovation, economic efficiency, and sustainability in the face of unforeseen global challenges. Here to present, please welcome Krystal Howell, Tara Frank, and Stephanie Felton.
Good afternoon, everybody. That's the exact energy I anticipated being the last presentation of the day and talking about the pandemic, so thank you for reaffirming that. So today we're going to discuss the impact of the pandemic on the construction industry. As many of you guys know, the pandemic brought about significant changes to the way construction companies operated and how their employees worked to meet organizational goals. Companies were compelled to implement numerous process improvements and innovations to maintain operations both within their office and at construction sites. Today, Research Team 400 will share with you our efforts to identify, understand, and categorize these disruptive events in hopes of, one, advancing the construction industry, and two, preparing for future disruptive events. In essence, our goal was to organize some of the chaos and uncertainty associated with the pandemic and provide the leaders in this room with useful tools that they can prepare for the future. So, I'd like everyone here to kind of imagine themselves. Streets were empty, facial masks became the new American Express, you never leave home without it. Construction sites were abandoned, and toilet paper was surprisingly cleared of all shelves in supermarkets. For most of us, this was not the unimaginable, this was our reality. First time in modern kind of recollection, the world almost stood still. And for those here in the States, specifically in the Northeast, we recognized in March of 2020, a new reality was coming. Personally, I live in a town 20 miles from Midtown New York. This is where Patient Zero was considered. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Outbreak, but it was eerily similar. The National Guard came in, they set up perimeters, hospitals were overflowing with sick patients, and there was no traffic in New York City. So when you think about it, the pandemic was stressful, and although it has ended, it still had lasting impacts on the construction industry. As a labor-intensive organization, people are at the heart of all that we do. And the pandemic, literally and figuratively, threw a monkey wrench in our plans. We were faced with attrition, where experienced workforce, like our last speaker had said, had decided to leave the industry. Due to government regulations, we had work shutdowns, travel restrictions, and of course, the social distancing, which had X telling us how far we need to stand from the next person. And as the pandemic tentacles continued on, we were then faced with worker shortages. Those shortages had impact from our supply chain, where our manufacturers couldn't provide some of the materials we needed. We also were faced with our contractors who didn't even have some of the experience and skilled labor force to do the work. And all of that resulted in project suspensions and delays. But don't fret, our industry was resilient. And we were creative, and we found 21 unique findings from our surveys to identify how we met those challenges. We implemented new safety procedures, we wore masks, we took body temperature checks. We reviewed our internal procedures, and we created staggered shifts. I don't know if anyone here had it, but we had Team A and Team B, could not come in contact with one another. And I think one of the most useful aspects that we recognized was the implementation of new technological innovations that were leveraged. We did video conferencing, we worked remotely, And most importantly, we were able to utilize tools visually that were remotely. And of course, all this required training. So looking at this chart, I'm sure this is represents the chaos that we all felt, but as an industry, we persevered. We literally lived the motto, necessity is the mother of invention. And here are two examples of that. When I first saw this slide, I was a little confused while my team member had put this together. How could workplace shutdowns and product suspensions be positive? But when you think about it, it allowed us to transition to work, to remote work. We had interviewed a project manager from a general contractor, and he says we can continue having our financial people, our engineers do our designing, our procurement all done remotely. And this mitigated some of the risks related to attrition, where people now, we provided that flexibility and can continue working from home. And I live in New York, so a commute to and from the office one way can be 30 minutes to 2 hours. And a lot of that time is now dedicated to people doing more work than previously, so productivity actually increased. From a project suspension perspective, that gave us a chance to kind of sit back, reassess current procedures, and with that, this particular company, they reviewed their estimating software. With that, they were now more competitively bidding projects, it reduced risk, and most importantly, it was not a one-time fix. It existed in the post-pandemic world. So, part of the research, we wanted to explore what other studies had been performed. We noticed that most studies really focused on the negative impact repercussions of the pandemic. Little to no research had been done about the pandemic on the construction industry. So we asked ourselves, what positive changes came as a result of the pandemic? What were those impacts of the changes? And whether or not those changes would be long-lasting. And to get a real sense, we actually interviewed a gamut of the industry. We looked at engineering firms, general contractors, owners. We spoke with executives, project managers, laborers, and support staff. And so we sought to fill that void, and we explored, and bear with me, potential positive pandemic-induced changes. Try saying that 3 times. So the question is productivity. We asked them, how is your productivity after the pandemic? Was it higher or was it lower? So before I answer that question, I know it's the end of the day, but humor me if you will. We'd like you to either scan the QR code here or go to menti.com and enter the code 25276551. I'll give you guys a moment to complete the survey. I'm waiting for the people in the back to put it up on the screen. Well, apparently I can't see that far. All right, so looking at the survey, it appears that you guys had said respondents agreed that productivity increased the majority of the times, was higher. I think half of you guys said productivity decreased, and a little quarter of that said productivity remained the same. So those in the blue, you guys took a peek at the presentation in the app. Right, so the results, thank you. The results overwhelmingly show that there was a positive impact, surprisingly, from the pandemic. 40% or 52% of the respondents had indicated that productivity remained the same, and a surprisingly 45% or 56 individuals had said productivity increased. And if you shift your eyes to the chart here on the right, despite the disproportionate number of respondents from our office and field employees, both groups agree that less than 20% of the time, productivity decreased. And we wanted to understand why. In spite of the pandemic wreaking havoc. So what did we do? We developed a 4-pronged approach. The first 2 steps were more of a data gathering, fact-finding analysis, where first we looked at business reports, any academic papers that we can find regarding the pandemic impact on businesses. The second part was more of a deep dive. We conducted one-on-one interviews with 40 industry leaders, and each interview lasted 1 hour. We had enough data then to create a survey which we deployed via a phone app or on a computer. That survey was about 15 to 20 minutes, and we measured our findings and asked them to measure them with 5 metric areas. And then with all of that data, we then created a reference guide that you guys can use and we'll discuss towards the end of the presentation. So in essence, we had pretty good turnout. Close to 300 people participated in our research. 85% had at least 10 years or more within the construction industry. And for those employees who worked at the companies, there was a 50-50 split between companies that had 1,000 or above or below. So in essence, we really covered the full spectrum of the construction industry. So what did we find? We found there were 21 changes that the construction industry implemented to circumvent or mitigate some of the challenges from the pandemic. We broke those into 6 categories. We looked at the workforce, impact to attrition. We wanted to know what technological changes were implemented. We wanted to know what processes and procedures were altered in order for us to continue operations. And then we also looked at our contracts and supply chain as our external parties. And then lastly, what safety measures were implemented. We then took those 21 categories and asked our survey respondents to measure those over 5 metric areas. We've already discussed the productivity, but we also wanted to know, out of those categories, which ones had impacted the cost, which ones had accelerated or decelerated the schedule, what were the impact to collaboration, not only internally, but also with external stakeholders, and lastly, what was the impact on the work quality? And I think the most important piece is whether or not these changes would last in the post-pandemic world. So next, we'll have 2 case studies, one discussing workforce and the second about technology, and Stephanie will discuss workforce. Thanks, Steph.
Thanks, Krystal. All right. Our first case study is remote work, and that was something that many of us never seriously considered before the pandemic, but it became a reality for many of us. And it was a hot topic in our interviews and surveys as well. So we're going to talk about who experienced remote work, where they were in the project life cycle, and what comes next. So at the beginning of March 2020, I was talking to a colleague and a friend of mine who lived in Seattle, and she was telling me that the first COVID cases that were happening took place there, and they had closed her son's school down for 2 whole weeks. And I was in denial about this, that this could happen potentially to me, and of course it did. I think many of us in this room recall early 2020 when every day became Take Your Child to Work Day. And so the pictures you see on this slide right now, 2 of them are stock photos, the ones on the left, but the one on the right, that is my own. And that shows what the reality of remote work plus loss of childcare looked like in my home. There's my husband turned coworker and our 2-year-old intern. And I show this to you not to demonstrate how adorable my intern was, and he was as well very unproductive, but it's also to demonstrate the gamut of remote work in our industry. My husband is also a structural engineer. He works for a firm with fewer than 50 employees, and he is on the design side. And then I'm behind the camera, and I represent the federal government, the owner side. And when we started remote work, I was told by my employer that I would be remote working, and they started passing out laptops like candy. My husband, his firm, they didn't really have such plans, and so when school closed, I started working from home and simultaneously attempted to parent our 2-year-old at the same time. And that lasted 2 days, and I informed my husband that he would also be working from home. So his firm ultimately did follow suit. I think due to pressure from most of their clients were also working from home. So that became a reality for us. And you would think I wouldn't have been unprepared for this eventuality. Actually, back in 2016, I was in Research Team 326, and we put together an implementation tool on how to maximize virtual team productivity. And I thought about using that at the beginning of the pandemic on my own team, and then I realized, Change was already here. We were already remote working. There was no more time for preparation. It was just go time. So, but I do recommend you check that out in the future. So remote work was a fundamental change. It was the biggest change we experienced as a result of the pandemic in our industry. And it was a big topic for our interviews and our survey respondents. In fact, in the interviews, 30% of all of the conversation topics that we discussed were covering remote work. And all of our interview respondents experienced remote work in some way, and 2/3 of our survey respondents experienced it as well. So not everybody remote worked, though. Who was most likely to have remote worked? Of course, owner companies, larger firms, those who are more senior in the workforce. And this jives with my own personal experience. I work for Smithsonian now. I worked for the State Department at the beginning of the pandemic. And having employees work remotely was a way to implement the public policy of reducing the spread of the virus. So that was a policy decision. Those who were least likely to have experienced remote work were those in smaller firms, those who were earlier in their careers, and then, of course, those who have work on site. Despite all the tools and technology that we have, there's still no way to build something remotely. Although I saw the Boston Dynamics dog over there. That robot dog might be coming for all our jobs eventually. It's frightening. All right, so remote work was something that was pretty new to our industry. It was something that was offered for many of us. We knew someone who remote worked. It was nominally there. No one really took advantage of it. Fully 2/3 of our respondents said it was completely new as a result of the pandemic. Only 3% of our respondents had experienced remote work in any meaningful capacity prior to the pandemic. So the pandemic was a catalyst for workforce change. And how did it go? We saw a little bit of this with Krystal talking about the positives were productivity. We just saw that with the Menti survey. It was, there was a lot of positivity about, regards to remote work and through the pandemic. We saw overall positive and at very least neutral in terms of productivity, cost, and work quality. But the big problem we had was with collaboration. That was where things suffered most. And I can attest to this. I onboarded at Smithsonian 2 years ago, fully remotely. We've, until recently, been working mostly remotely. And I have coworkers that I work with every day, and I have a couple of them I still don't know what they look like. So it's hard to build relationships. It takes a lot longer when you don't have that in-person collaboration or the opportunity to engage outside of formal meetings. Now, how is remote work perceived? Perhaps no surprise, general contractors perceived it less favorably. And why wouldn't they? Of course, construction is taking place on the site, and they might have challenges in getting a hold of people they need for timely input into the project. This also, Anirban talked about this a little bit, that younger workers perceived remote work more favorably. So that's expected, but there's a double-edged sword there that it is harder to assimilate new employees into work culture. It is harder to oversee their work and to mentor them when you don't really have that opportunity for engagement. So where does this lead us? 3/4 of our respondents feel that remote work is here to stay. And we saw some benefits of remote work, that it's actually can be more efficient when you don't tie a task to a specific time or location. There are some efficiencies there. So it's something that many plan to continue permanently after the pandemic. And so where does this take us? What now? Well, we need to understand that there are the benefits that I just mentioned to remote work, the efficiency, the engagement. There's also maintaining and recruiting employees. Many see the flexibility as a benefit. But there comes the differentiation between where it is really appropriate and not appropriate. Of course, not all tasks can be made remotely. So our report, our whole research team, the goal was to identify the beneficial changes that we can maintain and identify the more negative changes for mitigating risk in the future. And you might be surprised to realize that remote work, fully remote work, does not sort into the beneficial changes. Remote work was a tool to keep our work going. Remote work was actually a mitigation in itself. So, but where does that take us? We recognize that it's not going away. There's an expectation now, and there are benefits to improving our industry with increased efficiency and flexibility. And so we recommend adopting a hybrid model. This gives us the opportunity to keep that focus and that efficiency of remote work and what workers are coming to expect in the industry, but it also, we need to allow for that in-person collaboration and that relationship building that comes with in-person operations. So that's where we take it, and now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague DT to talk a little bit about the technology that got us through the pandemic.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, how are you guys doing today? Excuse me, because normally I'm in FRCs, steel-toe boots, and a hard hat, so I feel a little different up here today. But yes, we are actually going to go into our case study 2, where we will talk about technology and how site work became smarter. Sorry. Okay, so if you all can go back with me pre-pandemic, and where were you? December 2019, I was working for an EPC contractor at the time, working on a working on a distillation unit in Galveston, Texas, right next to the port of Galveston. So there were a lot of ships, the cruise ships that come in and out right there. So we had a lot of contact with thousands of different people all the time. And I still remember one of my coworkers, who was the site scheduler at the time, getting sick. And it ran rapid through our office. Literally a domino effect. All of us got sick, and we were trying to figure out what happened. And we were actually, at the time, experiencing COVID. The loss of taste, loss of smell, flu-like symptoms, and we even experienced a fatality with an older, seasoned worker. So still trying to wrap our heads around that and figure out what did that mean. So the pandemic forced contractors to have to confront the challenging task of understanding how to continue working, as well as how do we keep our workers safe, all while confronting and understanding what that will look like with the newly implemented government regulations. So we go back to March 1st through May 31st, 42 states and territories mandated the stay-at-home orders, if you guys remember. So in that time, myself included, because I was a site worker, and at the time, construction workers were actually considered essential workers. So trying to figure out what childcare looks like. Oh my God, what's going to happen? How do we keep people coming in? How are we going to have people work in the field? So what did that look like for on-site workers? We had to do a lot of reorganizing. So we had to adjust crew sizes, basically making them smaller, and actually gave opportunities for others to move up in certain managerial roles like foremans and stuff like that. We staggered our work hours and lunch times so that we can limit contact. And then, of course, in construction, safety is the #1 priority. So what does safety look like? How do we continue moving forward that way? So, of course, the 100% of wearing masks, social distancing. I'm sure you guys remember the X's on the floor and the 6 feet. I'm sure you remember the 20-second rule of washing your hands. And then, of course, my favorite, having a thermometer placed up to my forehead every morning before going into work. So, most project workers are integral to site activities, of course. So as my colleague was just speaking, how do we collaborate with site workers, such as myself, and then Stephanie, who was working remotely? So that's how we came about, of course, with these technologies. So remote meetings, design and document review, and share visualization, and site management. Aside from the significant negative impacts of the pandemic on construction projects, such as the schedule delays and the increased costs of the pandemic, many positive changes on construction was made, especially by accelerating the adoption of these technological advancements. So, of course, I was just speaking on what remote meetings look like. Of course, I'm sure you all know about WebEx, Zoom, Microsoft Teams. And then, similar to many other industries, design and document review platforms also enabled real-time information sharing. And we've seen an increase in that. So an increase in utilizing Bluebeam and Muralboard and BIM, just to name a few. Then an increase in site visualization technologies such as photogrammetric 3D modeling for coordination using drone data for overview of projects was adopted during the pandemic. So a couple HoloLens, Google Glasses, Tableau. And then site management tools have been used more during the pandemic, including the use of tablets, more mobile devices, actually having hands-on items in your hand as you go out there with real-time updates. So, out of the many technological advancements we talked about in the previous slides, we would like to share the ideas and thoughts that many construction folks thought were beneficial during the time of the pandemic. So we decided, for the sake of this presentation, to go into the document and design review platforms and site visualization. All right, so if we go back to our survey results, you'll notice that 45% of the respondents experienced an increased use of document review platforms, along with 24% utilizing site visualization technologies. So what did that look like? So different organizations and professionals experience differently the changes as you can see in this figure. The use of the design review platforms were more likely experienced by owner companies, executives and PMs, office workers. And then when we look at site visualization and what that looks like, you'll notice that larger firms utilize these, executives and senior workers with 20+ years. Overall, companies that manage construction projects without physical attendance on the job site benefited more from these technologies. Then, inversely, if we look on the other side, who least likely experienced and what they were experienced by, we'll notice that general contractors, engineers, and site workers were less likely experienced on the document and design review side. And then when we look at site visualization, you'll notice the smaller firms, engineers, and newer workers. And the reason why we look at the smaller firms and the newer workers because of the upfront costs and initial investments that it took to implement these site visualization tools, and then for newer workers, the training. So, what does that look like? In the survey, more than half of the respondents reported both technologies were already in place and had widely been used before the pandemic, while fewer than a quarter of them reported that these new technologies were new. When it comes to the impact induced by the technologies, most respondents showed their positive perceptions for all indicators. The use of document design review platforms were perceived mostly and positively if you can look at the scale. And then when we look at the productivity and the schedule, you'll see somewhat negative. And the reason why these, I believe, were some negative perceptions on there was due to needing to train these employees and the time that it took to train these employees. Then we move to the long-term, for these site visualization technologies and respondents perceived positively as well for site visualization. And then you'll notice that in cost, there was some negative impact and changes and why it was perceived like that. And it was mostly because of the cost that it took initially. All right, so what does that look like for long-term use for these technologies? Well, you'll notice that for the future implementation for design and document review platforms that we are looking at it to remain 99% permanent, with only 1% remaining temporary. And then inversely, when we look at the future implementation of site visualization technologies and what that looks like, 96% remaining permanent, and 4% being temporary. So, what are some key takeaways? First, we need to think of the long-term benefits of these technologies and understand that it will cost. So what does your initial investment look like as we move forward? Then two, be prepared from a technological standpoint. Companies can be prepared and need to establish the necessary IT infrastructure and software that it takes for these circumstances, which will benefit the company and also what that looks like for the objective of the company as well too. And then last, we look at the training. We need to train our employees. If we do not train our employees, then we will not be able to advance with these technological advancements as they continue to move forward. And thank you guys. I appreciate you, and I will pass it back on to Krystal.
Thanks, DT. Thanks, DT. So I just want to show my appreciation for my co-presenters here. They've done a remarkable job summarizing some of the challenges that we face, but through our perseverance and resiliency, we were able to see some of the changes that we made from a technological and workforce-related lens. So undoubtedly, we did face significant challenges, but we showed that we're stronger and resilient. So just to reiterate, we had 21 changes here that we implemented to mitigate some of the risks associated with the pandemic. Those 21 changes were categorized into 6 functional areas where we measured them over 5 impact areas from cost, productivity, schedule, collaboration, and work quality. And since this is a construction research team, we thought we'd tell you which of the 21 changes were construction related. So all 21 changes are listed on the chart in the middle. If you shift your eyes to the right, you will notice that the items in green are construction focused. And most of the changes that were construction focused were in technology, management planning, and contracts. So we implemented the use of new data visualization tools that DT had mentioned. We had drones paired with 3D photogrammatic modeling. We had webcams at our work sites, so therefore people can monitor and get real-time information without having to go on site. Secondly, we deployed mobile tablets. That is really a game changer because not only can you review documentation in the field, you can also enter units of work instead of having to go back to the office, which may be full of other employees. Another great impact was companies kind of reassessed their internal procedures, and instead of going on site for virtual inspections, factory virtual acceptance testing was now allowed. So again, being remote anywhere in the world, being able to factory test something gave more flexibility for us to meet some of the challenges of the pandemic. And of course, everyone here has probably seen the multiple pages in a construction contract. We do have some unique T's and C's associated with our industry, so providing some flexibility with our contracts, with our stakeholders, has also improved our ability to complete our construction projects. So taking those 21 changes, we organized them in a descending order from most positive perceived using the Likert scale. You'll notice out of the 21 changes, 11 were perceived most positive by our survey respondents, which again were 245 people. Just so you get an understanding of the chart, there's an alphanumeric code in front of each item. So the first one is T5, where we increased the use of on-site management platforms. T5 represents T for technology. That was the 5th technological change, so that was the most positive perceived. In total, we had 6 technology changes, 6 management changes, which were split between most positive and least positive. We had 4 workforce changes, which also was split 50-50, and we saw that supply chain, contract, and safety were the least positive perceived, which we'll discuss in some future slides. So looking at the top 11, this is what we're doing right. You'll notice almost across every metric area, everything is green. We do see some slight reds within the cost. And why is that? If you look at the upgraded IT infrastructure, many companies had to increase server storage, buy new licenses, specifically for use something like Microsoft Teams so we can continue to collaborate remotely. And the same thing could be held true for the last item, which is provided additional benefits. Companies were providing more comprehensive insurance plans, providing mental health services to their employees. That was a cost, which also provided additional productivity because now we took away some of the stress that employees were once feeling. So despite minor hiccups in that metric area, overall, these are things that you have done and should continue to doing in the post-pandemic world. Looking at the bottom half of that chart, these were the least negative perceived. So again, just because they were perceived negatively, does it mean that we should stop doing it? Absolutely not. We should at least document it because these things actually helped us during the pandemic. And I want to just kind of point out, I have my safety guy over there, Mike Muggio, and you'll notice the last item was implementing new safety measures. As a construction company or industry, we follow OSHA. How can implementing something that is positive and keeping our employees safe be perceived as negative? But when you think about it, right, you have staggered shifts. You have less people working on a project at one time. There is some negativity to that. But despite those negative perceptions, we were still able to keep our employees safe, maintain flexibility, and reduce risk. And so that's the takeaway from this slide. And as we, delve, go back. And as we kind of delve further, I just want to point out there are 4 areas. When it comes to supply chain and contracts, again, we do not operate in a vacuum. We rely on our suppliers, our contractors to perform work for us. So we really need to kind of assess more of those contracts, and we see that as more of the risk. So these are things that we need to look at now, address now, because a future event will happen regardless of a pandemic or some other event. Not trying to be a doomsday person here either. So what did we learn? We learned that remote work, technology, and flexibility were the life raft that kept us afloat during these uncertain times. We've identified several changes that has helped the industry persevere during the pandemic. My co-presenters here, have outlined the technological changes that will continue to persist in the post-pandemic world and the importance of remote work in attracting new talent. So all of this has also helped with our risk, and of course, we wanted to share with the industry leaders in this room. So we developed a reference guide here that in detail outlined the 21 changes that we found, and to make it even easier, the reference guide includes a handy information card for each and every one of those 21 changes. It summarizes the changes, it shows you the impact across the 5 metric areas. It also shows whether or not said changes would be permanent or were just temporary just to mitigate the pandemic. So before I end, you'll notice that we have an all-woman co-presenting team, but we did have a lot of help from a few other people. So Sean Music was part of our team, and we had 2 individuals from University of Texas, Austin, Dr. Casey Faust and Q-Don Kim, which were just invaluable in helping us with our presentation today. So I know we had some uncertain times, and I hope that today's presentation mitigated some of that uneasiness and provided you with some useful tools. So I guess I will say thank you and see you at the Alamo. Good night.
Thank you, RT-400, for a great presentation, a great reflection on the past couple of years that all of us experienced, and some helpful nuggets about some takeaways and ways for us to move forward well. We'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So first question, how did the pandemic help solidify or even form relationships of partnering companies, owners, contractors, and other stakeholders when everything was virtual?
I guess I'll start, and then I'll kick it to you guys to chime in. But I think that the shared adversity helped us all to kind of see that it was all of us against the problem, which was the pandemic itself. So I think that there was a lot of give and take, a lot of camaraderie, a lot of understanding when people couldn't figure out how to unmute themselves or make their camera work or whatever. So I think that that shared adversity was helpful because it was what we hope will be a once-in-a-lifetime kind of event. And so I think that our partnerships that help us get through all of our capital projects, helped us get through this as well. So.
I think you summed it up well. Thank you.
Great, great. We do have an international attendance here, so a few people are wondering about your research and findings around how this hybrid model worked within the U.S., if you explored any data outside of the U.S. and even cross borders.
So we did have data outside the U.S. It was predominantly centered towards South Korea. Pretty similar results, but today we presented more from a U.S. perspective, but the data within the reference guide, which also includes the information cards, will provide some additional information on domestic versus international. We also looked at it, even looking at geographically within the states, because there was different experiences from the Southwest to the Northeast.
Yeah, great. It's still kind of in the virtual or at least hybrid model that many of us are operating within now. Many of the experienced workers who were maybe in the workforce before the pandemic kind of understood what it was to be productive, what their role was. So transitioning to hybrid was an adjustment, or virtual and now hybrid was an adjustment, but they still kind of knew their job. What's your sense of the newer professionals that are entering into the workforce, whether white collar or labor, and how are they able to figure out what it looks like to be productive in this hybrid environment we're in?
So I think it depends on in what industry you're working in, or what your skill set or what your job type is. So of course I would say for construction and laborers and workers that have to get actual hands-on experience, coming from out of the pandemic, it was a little difficult because you actually needed that hands-on experience. Whereas when you look at remote or onboarding someone remotely, and depending upon what their job tasks were, if they were able to utilize computers or the programs that way, then it was a little more difficult and different for your job force that was actually in the field. So I think it depends on the job type and what that entails.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think I would, go ahead.
I do want to add too, I don't like to group people, right? Someone's a Gen X, someone's a millennial, someone's a Gen Z, because I can tell you each one of those categories, I have amazing employees at each one, and one that definitely requires more attention. But technology is literally a lifesaver, right? So I created, and I work with IT to create several Tableau dashboards where I can actually monitor workflow and see how long something is in something's queue. And when Stephanie had mentioned about onboarding new employees and how difficult sometimes it can be to do that remotely, so what I've learned during the pandemic, because we onboarded several people during 2021 to 2022, I used Microsoft Teams, and I had team members actually train them, and we would record the session. So not only did they have a booklet on what to do, they can actually go back to the video recording from Microsoft Teams, and that was a way that now, not only for that employee, we share it with future employees who get hired. So technology really is robust and can really help kind of balance some of the challenges that we have, regardless of the generations that exist in the workforce.
And I think it also, there's just a shift. It's going to be a different experience for newer employees, those who are newer to the workforce. It's just not going to be the same experience that the rest of us started out with. And I think it's on us as managers and leaders to be flexible with that, because as we saw with the survey results, that productivity increased or at least was neutral in many cases. And so I think we're going to have to look at results more than just visibility, and we're going to have to get comfortable with the lack of visibility we might have and really manage more to results.
Yeah. Stephanie, you mentioned productivity there. Did your research reveal any information about the states that did not fully shut down? And their productivity during the pandemic versus those that did?
No. So we did not look at specifically, we looked at the US in its entirety. And yes, we did break it up into geographical areas. So yes, there were some states that didn't specifically have a shutdown, and it wasn't mandated shutdown, but a lot of companies made internal decisions despite government regulations to reduce workforce, do temporary shutdowns. So I think our data will reflect that inside of the reference guide.
Sure. One of the categories that you identified was health and safety, and you talked about that in a few angles. There's a question about mental health and well-being. And I'm curious, post-pandemic now, what are some key learnings or takeaways in the mental health space that the audience can be mindful of moving forward?
Well, I would say, you all have gone through the pandemic yourself. You've faced challenges. Maybe you have not communicated that at work. So I think just having a listening ear. I am the finance manager, the procurement manager, the material manager, and I'm also a psychologist. Like, I literally have an open door policy, either through teams, coming to sit down. So that is your way to get to know a person, and you can identify when people are actually going through challenges. So having a big team makes it difficult, but as leaders, that is our responsibility. Their safety is our responsibility. So I say get to know your employees and find that time to connect, set up some type of cadence meetings with them. But I think it's important because we're all in this together, and the pandemic showed that we're all in this together.
Great. Okay, last question. On the technology front, are you seeing anything post-pandemic that's being dropped technology-wise? People are not carrying with us moving forward, and why?
I think the only thing that's changed is people are not using actually desktop machines. Most of it is now mobile devices, laptops, cell phones. Microsoft Office 360 now, you can take it on the go. But other than that, it seems like technological changes really, the pandemic catapulted that for our industry. And in some respect, it kind of saved us. So the slide I had with all the greens, keep doing what you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you.
RT-400.